Hi, I'm Mark Lawson, president of Morningstar Music Publishers and the ECS Publishing Group. I'm pleased today to be joined by British composer Howard Goodall and Sid Davis to discuss a new work of Howard's entitled Unconditional Love. Sid is the Director of Music and Fine Arts at St. Luke's United Methodist Church in Houston, and Howard is known internationally for his work in choral music, film, and theater. So welcome.
Hi, Mark. Glad to be here.
Howard, give us a bit of the overall theme and feel of this work.
Unconditional Love, which I call a cantata of gratitude and remembrance, really came about because about a year ago in November 2020, Sid texted me to say, is there anything about this pandemic and about the experience we're going through and how we might feel in a year or a year and a half's time when it's beginning to, we might be able to sing again and perform again. Is there anything you'd like to write about it? And I said, yes, there is, because I think that this extraordinary experience that the whole world, all 7 billion of us human beings have been through, we have learned a lot about ourselves and about our communities and what we value and who's important and who isn't. And that we, I feel there was something that musically I could write. And indeed, in this case, I've written some of the text myself as well, because although I found poems that I thought were appropriate for the themes I wanted to cover, when I couldn't find a poem that said it, I decided to write it myself. And the three main themes are the idea of the gratitude we feel to health and social care workers and key workers of all kinds who got us through this or who are getting us through this pandemic, and how much we value them and our gratitude for that. The piece, in a sense, starts with the idea of Thanksgiving, which I know is a big festival in the United States. And I wanted to look at that in context and just say, well, it meant different things to different people over the period. But it's a lovely idea, in my view, as a non-American, that there is a festival to say, well, I'm thankful for whatever it is I'm thankful for, that I feel blessed for whatever I feel blessed for. So I took that as a starting point and then moved out to look more specifically at the kind of gratitude we would feel through this awful pandemic. There's a second theme. I feel that music can play an important part in memorializing those we've lost. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people have left us during this pandemic, and we can write something. I feel I could write something that could be sung now for a long time as a shared way of not letting us forget those people and the loss they've had. Indeed, in many countries, people couldn't even have funerals. They couldn't say goodbye in the way they wanted to. So part of the piece is about memorializing people we've lost and to deal with that loss and to confront that grief, not to walk away from it. And the third theme is, beyond that remembrance, to look to the future. And what have we learned through the pandemic, good and bad, about ourselves, and how we might honor the young in a way who, first of all, have had to have their lives put on hold through this whole thing. All the things we did in our 20s and when we were teenagers, all the freedom we had, all the things we tried and places we went, have not been available to young people during the pandemic. And they've had to put their lives on hold, really for our sake, for us older people. And I wanted to first acknowledge that fact, but also to say that the burden is on them, of course, to rebuild the world. And their energy and their spirit is going to be very important. So there's a movement about the young as well. And finally, I try and sum up all these things in a movement called Gratitude and Grace.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the beauties of this work actually is the fact that you are addressing something contemporary in a way that I think will have long-lasting effect. Particularly the future part, I thought was wonderful. And I think that you've done a marvelous job encapsulating those themes. So Sid, on your end, tell us about how the commission came about.
Well, this isn't our first commission of Howard, and we had such a fabulous experience before, and the choir loves his music so much, they really light up with his art. And it was in the midst of the deepest part of the shutdown, and I was just thinking 10 years from now, when we look back, we're going to want to have some art that grew out of this, that expressed maybe what we couldn't express any other way. And almost a year ago, exactly to this day, I said to Howard, what do you think? And of course, the wheels, as always, were immediately in motion, and the rest, as they say, is present history, because here we are.
I mean, I think one of the things that I feel about this is that it's not an explicitly religious work, although there are many religious themes that flow in and out. My intention would be to write a piece that people of all faiths and no faiths could embrace, because this is something we all of us, from whatever background, from whatever religion we follow or no religion, have gone through this together. This has been a huge community, collective experience. So I feel that, and whilst it's not specifically religious, it is, of course, part of a tradition of oratorios and cantatas that have been religious over the centuries. And I feel, in a way, it's part of a tradition, that Bach or Handel or Mendelssohn would all have recognized. And I'm trying to find language and poetry that's of our time, or more or less of our time, to express that. One of the poems, which is called If We Get Through This, is by a young living American poet, Maya Stein. One of the poems is by an American poet who died in 1977, so it's relatively contemporary. And another is by an English poet, Michael Rosen, who himself got COVID very badly, was in a coma for 48 days, and is still suffering from long COVID, even speak now. And he wrote a poem about the care he received from care workers. So they are very of our moment, I hope, these texts. And as Sid says, we hope that we would look back in 10 or 15 or 20 or even 100 years and say, this is what we felt, this is what we went through.
Mm-hmm. So I was actually going to go to where these texts came from. So you've mentioned a few of them, and I know that you've written a couple of yourself. How did you go about finding these texts? Where do you go, and kind of what's your process?
Well, in my previous large-scale works, Eternal Light, A Requiem, and Invictus, a Passion, which was commissioned by Sid and St. Luke's 2-3 years ago, in both of those cases, I didn't just want to take the old Latin or old scriptural texts and just do them again, because lots of people have done those settings. I wanted to take modern poetry, or perhaps more recent poetry, I should say, and find ways of reflecting those ideas in those movements. So it was something I'd already begun to do. And when I came to this, I thought to myself, this is a very particular circumstance that we're talking about here. I want to express things that are universal and, of course, deeply spiritual to many people, what they've been through, for good or for ill. And I wanted to do that through finding poems that I thought were appropriate. And I have a very large collection of poetry in my studio back in London. I think probably a lot of composers do, because they need to find inspiration and text to set. But a huge amount of that poetry didn't feel right for this moment and this time and this challenge. There was one poem in particular that I knew I wanted to set, and I couldn't remember what it was called or who it was by, only that I'd heard it read by an actor at a memorial service 35 years ago. And I just remembered this first phrase, and it was a beautiful poem about loss. And I eventually tracked it down, and it turned out to be by Catherine Garrison Chapin, an American poet of the early 20th century, mid to early 20th century, who wrote this poem after the death of her 7-year-old son in a boating accident. And it's the most beautiful poem about loss and about love surviving loss and this, that, and the other. And I felt that I really wanted to set this poem to music, and I felt it would fit in this piece. So that was a choice that I tracked down from my distant memory. As I say, there is a poem by a modern living American poet, Maya Stein, who writes about the experience that all communities felt during lockdown, which is they kind of discovered their neighbors and the small gifts of life and the small hobbies and collective activities, whether it's singing or playing an instrument, that they learned during lockdown. And that it was important to remember those good things that happened in that, as well as, the fact that it was a very difficult time as well, with sadness. There were also many things we discovered when we weren't allowed to gad around the world at high speed. We had to slow down and reflect on what our lives really were and what was important. She wrote a lovely small poem about this that I found on the internet and thought this would fit in this piece very well. So once I'd started to find those pieces, I then looked around for some things that would summarize some of these other feelings, and I couldn't find them. And I do write lyrics for my musicals, so it wasn't a completely strange idea that I'd have a go myself. Sometimes I have a go in order to sort of get the piece going in my mind and get the music going, and then I might drift off and find someone else. But actually, in this case, with the 3 or 4 movements that I wrote the text for, I felt that I was comfortable with doing them because I couldn't find another way of expressing it. And the music came out of those words at the same time, so it felt right.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that you've mentioned there that I've been watching is the fact that I see a lot of things come across my desk that are responses to the pandemic, and that some of it, as we work through the art, is going to be reactionary, and some is a reflection upon those times. And I think we're getting deep enough into it that we're starting to get some depth to the art that's coming out. And I really feel that in your work, that it isn't a knee-jerk reaction to the pandemic, but was more of a deeper reflection on what did this actually mean to us. And so I think your poetry fits very well in this context.
Thank you. That's nice of you to say so, Mark.
Well, talk about for a moment the forces. Well, I think first of all, the length of it, and then what you did musically as far as the forces, and then we'll kind of get into style.
It's about 35 minutes long. I guess if conductors put in a few more rallentandos, it might be a bit longer, but basically it's about 35 to 40 minutes long, which feels about right, I think, for the different themes that are covered in the piece. There's quite a lot of variation in terms of the sound, I would say. But having said that, I thought this was going to be a piece performed in the wake of the pandemic, when people were first starting to come back into churches and concert halls and schools and colleges and beginning to perform. And it seemed rather like Stravinsky during the First World War. He couldn't then do new pieces that required an orchestra of 80 people, because that would just be unrealistic in those conditions. And I felt that it ought to be a piece with quite an economical instrumental force to support the singers. There's one soprano soloist, a choir, and then a brass ensemble of 7 instruments and piano and organ, and that's it. So I felt that this was something that could be flexible and that would allow people to program it in the post-pandemic period, where no one's quite sure, where these people and players and instrumentalists, how they're all going to be brought together. And I put this idea to Sid, and I'm glad to say he was very supportive of that, because I think he's used to the fact that I say to him, just sit down, Sid, I'm going to tell you what the unusual orchestration is going to be. And I said, no, don't be scared, but it's just going to be 7 brass instruments, piano and organ. Are you okay with that? And he, I think he said okay.
Well, let me say, Howard's orchestration is always unique and always absolutely delightful. And one reason it's delightful is because it's unique. It's a sound, it's a combination of sounds you don't hear.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I actually love working with brass, but it's quite, one has to accept that you must orchestrate very carefully if you've got brass and choral singers, because if you're not careful, they occupy the same frequency zones in the air. And, singers love singing in Handel when the brass come in at the exciting moments, but you wouldn't really want a soloist competing with the trumpet at any one point. But there's something very moving about a brass ensemble playing quietly. It's like another choir. And when a solo trumpet picks out a keening phrase in something like a church environment, it is incredibly powerful spiritual sound, I think. And to bring the brass into a concert environment like this, but to say to them, you're not always going to be playing in the exciting fanfare moments. You're also going to be gentle and tender. And I suspect that many composers, when they've got a bigger force in there at their disposal, when they've got strings and wind, the strings and the wind get all the lovely tender bits, and the brass are brought in for the noise. And I wanted that not to be the case. I wanted the brass to be quiet and tender for much of the time. And there are moments in this, I hope you'll forgive me for saying this, talking about my own piece, but there are moments when the brass come in a sort of choral way, quietly, and it is absolutely haunting, that sound. and it does fit with the choir. So it's always, all my slightly quirky orchestrations are always a bit of a risk, but I think that in a way gives them, there's a sort of frisson in the air when you hear these things you're not quite expecting, these textures and colors. So we have performed the piece now in front of an audience, and I got the impression they were very taken with it and with the sound that they were hearing. I know you want to talk a little bit about idiom and the style that I write in. I don't think any composer is really comfortable with that question, because it's better for someone else to say what your music sounds like than you do. But I think I would say that my intention is to be emotionally direct. That's the first thing. And I think for me, that is coupled with melody. I really, for me, a strong melodic line is incredibly important. And because of that, I feel that with my choral background, you know, there's always a balance, isn't there, between the solo style of melody and the choral style of melody. They do work slightly differently, and there's a different texture there to work with, and words work slightly differently with a whole chorus and with a soloist. And to some extent, the soprano soloist takes some very soloistic lines throughout the whole piece. But actually, for much of the time, the chorus are also carrying big melodies. And in fact, the first day I arrived here, I got purloined by a group of altos in the corridor, who said, "We just want to say," and I was a bit nervous what they were going to say. And they said, "We just want to say thank you for giving us so much of the melody line, because we normally don't get it." But there was a sort of a richness in the alto, the contralto range that felt right for much of the ideas and the reflections in this piece. So they do carry more melody perhaps than they normally do.
Well, I think we've gone through a period of time here in this country where a lot of the new composition was kind of built on what I would call soundscape or very strophic, static, harmonic changes. And so it's always welcome to see some counterpoint and to see some individual lines that aren't necessarily always in accord. And
Yes.
so I think that is also indicative of your style that I've noticed. Say a little bit about the style, and then say something about also reception of the choir of the piece.
I've told the choir that they are the North American experts on singing Goodall, because we've sung a lot, I'm happy to say. And they resonate with it mightily. We had done a piece or two before we did Eternal Light. But Eternal Light, I've never seen anything like it. I've never seen a choir respond to music like that before. I think I could call them this afternoon and say, "Let's get together and sing Eternal Light tonight." And they would say, "Could we wait till Monday when we finish this recording?" But they would be here Monday night. It's amazing. We've done it 4 times, 5 times. This choir resonates so palpably with this music. It's amazing. And the music is, I told Howard, I said, a very high compliment. My office has an adjacent wall to the choir room, so I hear everything that goes on in the choir room. And when our keyboard people would be in there practicing, I'd be emailing or something, and I would hear the music, and before I could even register what it was, I would think, "I love this music. What is it again?" And it would be Unconditional Love.
While the choir were rehearsing the piece, I'm sure all composers will identify this, but you're a little bit nervous, especially if you're, 6,000 miles away. You're a little bit nervous about how the rehearsals are going and how the choir like your piece. And I kept saying to Sid and 1 or 2 other members of the choir, "How's it going?" When I was back in England, waiting to hear in the void. And he would say, "Well, we're finding it hard to get through some of the movements because everybody is very emotionally
Weeping.
touched by this, and especially now in the pandemic and with everything that's going on, they were very, very. The soloist of the movement, Bright Mariner, Grace Roman, did say, "The only way I'm going to get through this is to sing it about 150 times before I have to do it in front of an audience." Because it's very, very, it's a very emotionally charged movement.
I think one telling of the tale happened with Howard's experience after the performance. Talk about the congregation coming to you.
Yes, I think, and I don't know if other performers are finding this in this post-pandemic, or at least nearly post-pandemic period, which is that here we are doing performances for the first time again after a long break. And because of the route I took off stage, I got slightly trapped in the bit where the audience were getting out. And so I think because I was the recognizable conductor fellow, many of them, I would say maybe 100 of our 1,000-strong audience spoke to me individually. And I was very struck by the difference between between that and a normal performance, I would say, because what I was really struck by was that the sense of suppressed loss and anxiety and worry and separation from loved ones has been colossal around the world. And what people were really saying was, thank you for giving us a moment of catharsis. And I was really struck how emotional people were and how, yes, possibly even upset, but they needed to be in a room with other people and to express these and feel these feelings in a public environment, because they've all been privately away in their separate places dealing with this. And in all seriousness, I feel I've never experienced a performance like it. There's sheer intimacy of the personal revelations, people coming out to me telling them the people they'd lost and how they feel about that, and that how much the piece somehow allowed them to acknowledge those feelings in a public environment. And I asked on social media, I asked fellow musicians if they were having the same kind of experience, and they said yes. People are finding the going back into live performance very, very powerful emotional experience at the moment. And yet this piece is not another Fauré Requiem or another Mozart mass. It's actually about what we have been through. And I think people were sort of, in a way, prompted by the music to respond in that way to me very personally at the end. And also, there's that classical music protocol, you're not supposed to clap at the end of the movements. I don't mind that. I think it's a lovely thing. But what definitely happened at the end of the first movement was a spontaneous and unstoppable applause from the audience. And they did it with every movement. Now, I've never had that before, and it was unusual. And I did not mind it one bit, Mark, because I think people needed to be involved in the piece.
Yeah.
And it was certainly at the end, being very, very clear that we had a very long response at the end, and I think people just needed to feel that together.
Yeah. Well, I want to tell people that you are making a recording of this, and that you're recording it currently, and so by the time they hear this interview, that recording should be done and out. So I hope people will explore this work, and I hope that they'll find it to be something that is meaningful for them. So thank you both for talking about this, and thank you for your investment of time and for the way you've thoughtfully thought through what we need. I love it when art meets our human need at this point. And so I think this is something special, and I think you've got something that you can be proud of. So thank you both.
Well, and let me say thanks not only to Howard, because obviously what he's brought to us, but also to Morningstar for making things like this possible. I mean, what a huge gift to church musicians.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I should say also that the parts will be available from us as well. So thank you very much, and good luck with the rest of the recording session.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much.